This is the Fractal Mood, and we'll just rip the Band-Aid right off. The Fractal Mood is wrapped in an airflow impeding fabric that stifles performance and makes it look like an air purifier. It also makes it sound like one. One of the noises in that clip is an oscillating tone that you can only hear when the outer shell of the chassis is on. It goes away when the shell is off. But one of the better aspects of the case is this. The entire exterior shell is one piece that lifts off pretty easily, and when it's removed, it reveals a 180 millimeter top exhaust fan. So it's a clever design trying to utilize a negative pressure setup where it's going to pull air in just through two sides and then push it up and out. At least that's the theory. Before that, this video is brought to you by NZXT's C1500 Platinum Power Supply, which has passed the Cybernetics Titanium standard for efficiency. NZXT has been certified for efficient operation upwards of 94% and uses a 140mm fan to help run quieter under load. This 180mm form factor power supply is fully modular, using capacitors rated for 105 degrees Celsius. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the case is $150, which is middle of the road for the ITX world. The Mood also has some really interesting acoustical characteristics along with unique materials choice and construction. And when we first saw it, we thought that if it's executed well, the design could be good for thermals. Now, pitfalls for this design include potentially guillotining the cables when you're reassembling it, and then also this SSD bracket, which ends up affecting GPU thermals in a big way. It's not good. We were ultimately let down by the Fractal Mood. It has a unique aesthetic, but the case falls short in many areas. So the best thing about the case is the fact that it is super easy to disassemble and access everything, as we showed a second ago, where it comes apart in two pieces. So this piece is just a dust-filtered side panel, no fabric on this side. It's the only side without fabric, and that reveals the GPU. Once that is pulled out, the entire case shell slides up like that, and then there's a really small attention to detail element on this case, which is this Mylar tape at the very top, and that's in there to try and reduce that undesirable kind of scraping noise of metal on metal when removing this shell. So shows an attention to the detail that's really good. They also have, which we like, two screw points here that are available to try and lock the shell into place for transport and just for some peace of mind when moving it around. So pretty much the best thing about this case ends up being the accessibility of all the parts, where once that shell's removed, you can get to everything in there. Makes it very easy to cable manage later, with the exception of kind of watching out for guillotine cables. But the format of it is a vertical sandwich style upright tower, similar in some ways to the NCORE 100, which is its main competition that we've reviewed recently, although the NCORE 100 is only available with the power supply and a liquid cooler. So more expensive because it includes those, also more of a forced build path where you're buying three parts, so it takes up some of the creativity. Either way, it's a vertical tower with the motherboard and the power supply on the front side of the stationary spine. The GPU is on the back side, connected to the motherboard by an included PCIe riser. The entire top of the case is taken up by one of Fractal's 180mm dynamic fans from the Torrent, intended to pull warm air out from both the CPU and the GPU sides of the case. This creates a negative pressure system where air is pulled in through any hole in the case, mostly the two sides of the shell. So the Mood continues Fractal's experimentation with different materials for cases versus what's typically found on them. Previously, Fractal popularized the Terra and the North using wood paneling, and in this one they're using a fabric. So the construction of the fabric, we cut this piece off, is basically the fabric itself. It's just like a cloth on the outside. They have to find a mix of being porous enough to breathe, but not so much that it, one, becomes a dust nightmare as it disintegrates, or is just kind of saggy. And then on the back side, there's, you can see multiple layers where there's kind of, it looks like an adhesive here that helps hold it all together. And then there's basically what amounts to two layers of the fabric. Now with the Terra and the North, Fractal was successful in igniting the industry in a way where everybody tagged on with wood paneled cases. And that's all we saw at Computex this year. Although with fabric, I don't know, if you wanted to get the dust out of it, you'd basically just vacuum the outer shell of your computer. You should take it off the computer first, though. Fractal's Ridge case in 2022 started with this, with a small panel of fabric on the front, following the Inwin Alice previously. The Mood has fabric wrapped around nearly the entire outside of its exterior shell, which creates a unique look for a PC case and is reminiscent of Google's home speakers. It's well applied and it's not loose. Even directly beside where we cut the panel, the fabric is still firmly in place with some kind of adhesive. The weave of the exterior decorative layer on our sample was misaligned across the front, though, as a downside, which could be disappointing to users who want that super clean and symmetrical look. So underneath the exterior layer is a structural weave, and underneath that is a layer of perforated plastic with holes that align with the holes in the panel. This plastic also seems to act as adhesive, holding the fabric in place, and only the front and rear of the case has ventilation for intake. The sides are totally solid, which is intentional. At first glance, this looks restrictive to airflow. It has... Ow. Ooh, that cut me pretty good. We might keep that in. At first glance, this looks restrictive to flow because it's got those two solid panels, one down in there, and then if we just flip it over, you see the other one. And the reason it looks restrictive to flow is because it is. But we'll get to that in the thermal tests. Now, we can't objectively comment on the aesthetics for obvious reasons. You can make up your mind on the look yourself, but subjectively, we think Fractal is almost getting to the point of over-pandering to its grown-up gamer audience. That doesn't ultimately factor into the meaningful critiques in this review, and it's subjective, it's up to you, it doesn't really matter what we think. But there's enough to criticize without worrying about the look. The Mood is just the other end of the style scale, opposed to things like the Cougar Conquer series. Now, interestingly, in both the wood and the fabric instances of alternative case materials, it was Inwin that did it first in any kind of major manufacturer way. But Fractal was the one that made both successful. Inwin had wood-accented versions of its 305 and its 806 that it showed off in 2017. But as far as we know, they never came out. Then it had the Alice in 2019 with a full fabric cover, which did launch, but was of limited success due to its hamper-like appearance and limited marketing resources. The Mood being $150 means to us, its closest competitor, in style at least, is technically way more expensive than it. This is the NCORE 100. We reviewed it previously, and the reason it's more expensive is because it does force the inclusion of the power supply and the cooler. So this is $350. It's an extra $200. Depending on what you buy for the Mood, maybe they end up as a wash, but you also do have less of a choice with the NCORE 100 if you use what they sell you. And then there's the huge alternatives like the Tower 300 or the former Tower 100 series. This is a much different style of case. It's basically like 2.5 to 3 of the Moods in terms of the total size. But this would be kind of the next step up in the footprint while also being kind of competition, but really, this is just much more compact. Now, the Mood is a little bit shorter than the NCORE 100, but it is still smaller in at least one dimension, which is this is narrower. It can expand, but it's still narrower even when it's expanded. Other loosely similar cases include the Thermaltake Tower 200 and the Height Revolt 3, both of which are cheaper and don't use PCIe risers. The build layout leaves all of the main I/O from the motherboard and the GPU oriented downwards, so the case has to be tilted over to connect or disconnect anything. This is something the Cooler Master NCORE 100 Max did better by having the motherboard I/O still face the rear of the case. There's about 67 millimeters of space underneath the Mood, and we didn't run into any issues with cables fitting or making that bend. But it's possible that the bulkiest of USB or display cable plugs may not fit or contort properly. Front I/O is almost as good as we would want from an ITX case. So it does have 2 USB Type A ports, which is good, 1 Type C, but it has a combo audio jack. Typically, we like to see 2 of those, separated for the microphone and the headphones. All the standard I/O is on the bottom here. We would have liked to see 1 or 2 more USB ports that are accessible on the front as a result of that, or maybe use a built-in hub to achieve it, but then the price goes up. Dimensionally, the Mood measures at 213 by 213 by 453 millimeters. Fractal states 212 for the width and depth, but ours is 213, and we like to be pedantic here. We're glad Fractal is being realistic, though, with its measurements. The volume calculates out to 20.55 liters, which breaks the imagined 20-liter SFF barrier that some uphold. The Mood is tall, but it doesn't take up much space on the desk. It's at least SFF adjacent. Fractal isn't clear on what maximum CPU air cooler height is. It's either 114 millimeters as shown on the website, or 123 millimeters as shown in the manual, or 110 millimeters as we were told in person. but based on our measurements, it seems like 114 is the most accurate. For air-cooled tests, we used the 110mm tall Noctua NH-D9L, and there's just a little bit of room to spare with that. If a short enough air cooler is used, a fan could be installed over the top of it using the radiator bracket. It'd maybe be an interesting solution for downdraft coolers and would hit the VRM pretty well. 280mm and 240mm liquid coolers are also supported with a maximum radiator plus fan thickness of 67mm and up to 60mm tall for the block. But the thicker the cooler gets, especially with a taller block, the less room there is for air to actually get out of the chassis. This is where the problems begin. The cable management also gets more difficult. There wasn't much space left for our Kraken 280, which cut down on the efficiency of the top exhaust fan and caused some issues for the GPU that we'll get into in the thermal section. On the topic of the GPU, so the GPU can be 158mm tall in this dimension. It can be 325mm long and then 56mm thick, which is actually remarkably thin for a modern GPU. So that pretty much restricts you to maximally maybe a 4070 Super or something like that, because it's got to be 2 slots. You can kind of get 2.5 to work. It's just going to be really close to that panel edge. And so it's an odd decision where for a case of this relatively large, small form factor or SFF adjacent size, you're so restricted on the GPU size. One cool thing though is that the case pillar nearest the top of the GPU is actually removable, giving easier access for installation and removal. It's actually a pretty helpful touch. A 3-slot Founders Edition card shouldn't fit based on the measurements that Fractal gives, but it actually can with minimal effort. However, there are only 2 expansion slots in the bottom of the case, restricting the slot side exhaust. The Mood comes with a couple of drive mounts. So it's got one for 3.5. This mounts to where the fan area would be for the radiators. So using this would eliminate the option of a liquid cooler. Sorry for the one bloody finger I have. That's from this case. I don't know if we left that in the cut or not. Below it has, ow. Ooh, that cut me pretty good. I don't know what I got caught on. I'm trying to keep it out of shot now, otherwise we'll be demonetized. But the 3.5-inch drive sled, that can go in there. They also have these two. So this one mounts to the side of the case pretty cleanly. There's a 2.5-inch sled, goes near the cables for the power supply. And then this one is the problematic one. So that sled is for the top mount that we mentioned in the intro. It goes between the power supply and the top exhaust fan, and it requires temporary removal of the fan to install. It's a pretty weird spot, and the bracket isn't ventilated at all, and it actually ends up blocking off the Mood's only exhaust. That's especially true for the power supply exhaust, which ends up basically completely blocked, so it has to find its way out of the case somewhere else. This has a big thermal impact that we'll get to in testing later. And actually, we might as well just do that right now. So we have a ton of thermals on this. We've done some acoustic testing as well, because again, it has that interesting interplay of the fabric with the fans and making some strange acoustical noises depending on the configuration. So we'll look at that, but thermal's the big one, where what we've done is test with both a liquid cooler option. We used this cooler for air. So this one pulls in down at the bottom and pushes up, which creates an interesting air path as well. And then one of the key tests we did was with that drive installed, because if you have a drive sled here, even without the drive in it, it will block that hole. And as small as that is, it actually ends up being really important because the air from the power supply comes out here. And so that's the main way it finds its way out of the case. And with the sled there, it ends up building up elsewhere. So let's get into the benchmarking, and then we'll come back for the conclusion. Thermals start with CPU results under a full system torture workload. CPU frequency and power are locked, as are the fan speeds. And as usual for our ITX reviews, the data here is not directly comparable to any other case we've run in the past. The stock result with the 280mm CLC at 100% speed came in at 41 degrees Celsius over ambient across the P cores. Removing the outer shell resulted in a massive nearly 10 degrees Celsius reduction in the P-core average. This tells us that the outer shell is hugely restrictive for both intake and exhaust. Internally, there aren't many places for the air coming out of the CLC's fans to go. The air gets shoved into the tiny chamber with limited pressure pulling it out, and taller blocks reduce that volume even further. This poor performance is reinforced by the top fan off result, causing the P-core average to rise by 2 degrees Celsius. The top fan can't really pull air through the narrow passage between the internal components, and Cooler's own fans. It's just not doing much in this chamber. This is poor design by Fractal. Switching to air cooling with the NHD9L at 100% fan speeds results in a P-core average of 58 degrees over ambient. The point of this wasn't to compare the tiny tower cooler with a 280mm radiator. That's just a cooler review. We do those separately. But it was to see what happens when we take away the intake air restriction presented by the fabric cover. With the front side of the shell skinned, the P-core average dropped by 4 degrees Celsius. That's a ton just for removing the front fabric. This proves that the fabric is very restrictive on its own. Fractal chose to leave performance on the table in pursuit of a certain look. And the top SSD mount has effectively no impact on CPU thermals, but has a huge impact for GPUs, so let's get into that. The fans on our 4070 FE are locked at 35% unless otherwise noted. The air cooler config actually gives the best GPU thermals, with the GPU core at 49 degrees Celsius over ambient and memory at 40°C. The stock setup with the 280mm CLC is about 5 degrees Celsius warmer on the GPU, despite more fans and better CPU cooling. So here's what's happening. The exhaust air brought in from the liquid cooler is fighting for anywhere to go, and that includes going into the GPU side of the case. The GPU gets fed this pre-warmed air, maybe even causing a slight recirculation effect. Removing the shell drops GPU core temperature by 2 degrees Celsius, so not nearly as impactful as it was on the CPU side, which is because the GPU side does not have the restrictive fabric. And all this testing is before we skinned the case. But the GPU fans are also right up against the more normal mesh. Adding the top SSD mount underneath the exhaust fan has a huge and negative impact on GPU thermals, raising the core temperature by 9 degrees Celsius, which is massive. For a GPU, this increase is phenomenally and impressively bad. It forced the GPU clock speed down by almost 150 megahertz, so without clock throttling, the temperature increase would have been even higher. Fractal's design here is poorly thought out and does the GPU a huge disservice. GPU exhaust from the flow-through portion of the card normally is able to go into the power supply and then out through the slot above it. But the SSD bracket blocks off a significant portion of that slot. So between that and the radiator fan actively blowing air towards the power supply exhaust, it doesn't have a fighting chance of helping to evacuate the GPU's exhaust. It's possible to flip the PSU around so the fan faces the other way, but then the GPU would just be blowing into a wall, which is maybe worse. Raising the GPU fan speed to 66% with the top SSD mount in place brings the core temperature back down to the previous stock levels. This mount is just bad, and it should be avoided. Finally, we can see that the top exhaust fan is actually integral to the GPU components, as turning it off had the GPU running 12 degrees Celsius warmer than the stock setup. So it does something here, and that's even with lower clock speeds. Fractal has poorly balanced the behavior of its two chambers. Quickly moving to the VRM and RAM thermals again shows us how restrictive the Mood's shell is. With the no shell results, it's much lower than everything else. The bottom end of the CPU side of the case just doesn't have anywhere for the air to go, which can affect VRM temperatures and RAM. And other than that, the liquid cooler has an advantage over the air cooler due to the former having a fan blowing directly onto the motherboard. Now onto the acoustic testing in our chamber. We found something really interesting while going through the data after noise testing. Things like this are made possible by the hemi-anechoic chamber that we built, and that was only possible from the huge support we've gotten from you all. So to continue supporting our efforts to expand accurate testing that uncovers phenomena difficult to explain without specialized equipment, head over to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our PC building anti-static mod mats with PC wiring diagrams, screw tracking grids, and reference materials. You can also grab one of our 3D metal emblem pint glasses to show support. Here's the result. With the 280mm liquid cooler installed, the outer shell of the Mood seems to have a resonant type noise around the 180 Hz area. It also has peaks forming at the multiples, actually, of 360 Hz and 720 Hz. This is clearly audible in the recording, even without isolation. It's the slow rising and falling drone that you'll hear in our example in a moment that sounds something like a distant lawnmower. When the shell is removed, the lower frequency droning sound is gone, and you can see that in our frequency spectrum plot, where the shell-less test, despite losing the blocking wall, is quieter in some of the lower and mid frequencies. The wall helps a little bit with blocking some of the higher frequencies, as you'd expect. The noise also wasn't present during our testing of the NHD9L air cooler, so some aspect of the liquid cooler fan specifically makes that behavior arise, and it's probably the fact that they are right up against the shell. This could be a blade passing frequency impact, but here's an audio sample of the two. Distant lawnmower really is our best description for it. If you want to learn more about acoustic behaviors like this, you can also check out our interview with Jacob Dellinger of Noctua. But let's get into the conclusion. Now, overall, I'd say Jeremy and I are critical of the Mood. So Jeremy did the bulk of the review work. I helped him kind of think through some of the thermal scenarios and some of the behaviors we were seeing. And we both came to the same conclusion, which was that it just doesn't perform like it needs to for the style. So part of that is because these 180 millimeter fans, I'm just kind of observing some of the flex here too. But anyway, part of it is the 180 mil fans where they are phenomenal at cooling in the right environment. And the big thing with larger fans is you start to lose pressure. And this is meant to be a negative pressure setup, meaning that the only fan is, other than the component fans, is pushing air out of the case. So what will happen is air will find its way in through every other hole of the case because that's just how they've set it up. Now that can work really well. And oddly, in cases like the NZXT, I think it was the H510, we saw better performance with it only negatively set up without any intake fans because of how they designed the case. So it can work. The problem with 180s, though, is that they lack a lot of the pressure you'll get from a 120. Fractal, though, is trying to fill the largest footprint it can and basically take up 100% of the area on one side of the case. So they use the 180, they thicken it using the torrent fan to try and get some of that pressure back, but it's still just not enough. But going through some of the positives and the negatives quickly, overall, we did find the Mood excellent to build in. They did that phenomenally well. The access to components is well done. The chassis works in a super accessible way, and the case comes with a clear manual that has well-documented instructions. Kill management is also mostly easy with the tie-down points everywhere. The only critique of that being some of the guillotining we mentioned earlier, but you just hold them out of the way, and that mostly is resolved. Downsides include tight clearance in some areas for those cables, particularly watching the interference with the CPU side fans. And then the PCIe riser is also a little bit too long, so its slack ends up mostly protruding across the shell's path. The Fractal Mood ends up being a looks-focused case that prioritizes form over function, despite trying to hit function with the airflow layout. The fabric ends up being restrictive to airflow, proven by a 4°C drop on the CPU after we removed the fabric, which is massive. And a more traditional metal mesh version would be better, as well as ventilated sides to allow air out near the bottom. Still on the thermals, the top SSD bracket ends up being restrictive to GPU thermals due to blocking off the power supply exhaust when the power supply is oriented to help with flow-through GPUs, which is how we'd recommend it if you have a flow-through GPU. And as is, it's better overall as an air-cooled case than with a liquid cooler, in our opinions. The question I had for Jeremy at the end of the process was, so would you buy it? This is when I'm acting as sort of the test lead for a project, my role ends up being, okay, let's figure out how we distill all of this down into a decision. And he thought about it for a second. I think we both came to the same conclusion, which is that we both feel like the NCORE 100 pulled off this concept better. Now, the biggest downside to the NCORE 100 is, once again, that it requires a certain style of building. So it takes a little of the freedom out of it, where you're buying the Cooler Master included power supply and radiator, but functionally as a small tower, it just executes it in a better way. It cools better. Fractal's attempt at blocking off two of the sides, it makes sense, and the reason you would do that is because in theory, you block off the two sides, you force it all through the CPU and the GPU, it's allowing what pressure is created by the component fans and by the top fan to focus everything into the core components, but it just doesn't function the way it needs to. In reality, it's restrictive for GPU size for the compartment that it's in, which is kind of strange for how big the case ultimately is. And the fabric, although interesting, for us, being our bias is towards performance, it's just not good enough. You're trading too much to get this look. And, well, that's the side with the hole in it. This look, God damn it, this look, you're trading a lot to get that look. So if you want an air purifier in your living room and you're okay with the trade-offs, great. We're not going to stop you from buying it because some parts of it do work really well, like the mechanics of it, but we wouldn't recommend it in general. We think that the form factor is better fulfilled by other cases on the market, and that's going to be it for this one. So it basically purely comes down to the looks and if that's your thing or not. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by buying one of these shirts. We bought some extras of these. They are on the store, and they're in manufacturing now. We made these for the, I think it was either the EK or the ASUS series, and so those are on the store, and that directly helps fund all of our testing efforts. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.